Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Orla and I'm delighted to be joined by Rick van den Bosch from Betabit in the Netherlands, who will present the topic Azure Static Web Apps hit the ground running. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC22. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. Continue your Azure learning by joining us again on Friday, the 19th of August for another webinar. Start building serverless applications on Azure by Mark Duker from Ably in the Netherlands. Deep dive into topics of your choice with the ESPC22 tutorials. Experience a full-day expert-led workshop on the SharePoint framework, search, security, AI, hybrid work, Azure Arc, Microsoft 365, or Microsoft Viva. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com/ESPC22 tutorials. Our ESPC22 early bird sale is now on. Save €200 on 3- and 4-day tickets. Find out more at sharepointeurope.com. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it's available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our presenter, Rick. Hello, Rick.
Good morning for me at least, or good afternoon or good evening for anybody else who is joining in from all over the world probably. And thank you so much for having me for this session today.
Thanks for coming, Rick.
Sorry?
Just saying thanks for coming. Thanks for...
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to dive right in since I have a lot of content to cover. We only have an hour, so I'm going to dive right in. My name's Rick. The last name is Dutch, so it's kind of hard for some people to say, but I think you did an awesome job there. So it's Rick van den Bosch in Dutch, but just Rick is fine. Online, my handle is Rick VD Bosch everywhere, so you can just type that into Google or Bing or Yahoo or DuckDuckGo, and you will find me. I'm a principal cloud architect at Betabit and a Microsoft Azure MVP for 4 years now. Let's have a look at what we're going to do today. So first of all, I would like to go into a small introduction of what Azure Static Web Apps actually is. We'll cover the basics 1 and 2, have a look at some additional features that are available. We'll talk the hosting plans, which are also very interesting as far as costs go. I do have some new features added since those were added to Azure Static Web Apps relatively recently. And I think they're awesome, so I think I should mention them at least. And then we'll have the resources for the talk today. You'll have one link that leads you to all of the other links you'll need, so you don't have to write along the way. We can go there while we're working. So first of all, let's have a look at the introduction. Let's introduce what we're actually currently working with. Now, looking at hosting a static web app or a static web application in Azure, we used to move towards static website hosting in Azure Storage. And this is actually a feature of Azure Storage that enables you to enable static website hosting, so it serves static content from a $web container in Azure Storage. You explicitly enable that on a storage account. It works, and it works great since storage is primarily targeting at hosting files, and a static web app is just hosting files, right, since it's static. So it's a feature on Azure Storage. It comes with no additional cost. However, you have case-sensitive file names. The requests are read-only, and you have anonymous requests since there's no authentication in place by default. So that used to be the solution for us if we wanted to have static files that we want to host for web. Now, the next thing is we would like to add some dynamic stuff to our application. So if you have a single page application front end talking about, let's say, Angular or Blazor WebAssembly, Svelte, Vue, React, all of those can talk to an API, and then you can have some dynamic content inside of that static website. So normally we used to do that using Azure Functions, since with Azure Functions you could accelerate your development with an event-driven and serverless compute experience, which scales on demand. So the cool thing about functions is that you actually really pay for what you use. And if you don't use it, you literally don't pay. That's the meaning of serverless, right? It scales down to 0. Now, just a small heads up, the logo for Azure Functions that we see here on the right was actually created with the generic thing of codes with the brackets and slash, but with the lightning bolt for events and data. And those of you who might have developed Windows Forms applications way back when might recognize the lightning bolts that we also had in Visual Studio. When you selected the button and you wanted to go to the events, those were the events, right? So code and events plus data equals Azure Functions. Now, the reason why code and events plus data equal Azure Functions is the fact that Azure Functions has triggers and bindings. In short, actually about functions, functions are code that runs based on a specific trigger. So you write code for when something happens, and the code is only executed when that thing happens. So looking at the triggers, they cause a function to run. A function always has exactly one trigger, and those triggers have associated data. That data is often provided as the payload for the function or to the function. So that means if you have a trigger, for instance, of an HTTP request coming in, which can be a trigger for Azure Functions, you can have the HTTP request be provided into the Azure function as a parameter by default. Now, next to triggers, so next to what actually makes our code run, we also have bindings. And then bindings are a way of declaratively connecting other resources to your function. So you can have an input or an output binding, or maybe even both. And then the cool thing there is it also completely abstracts away the resource you're trying to talk to. And I'm going to have a small demo later on where I can show that. But in the end, what this means is that you don't write any boilerplate code anymore for connecting resources inside of Azure. So storage account, you have that available. Table storage, you have that available. Cosmos DB, you can just have a table client and talk to it directly. So that actually enables you to focus on creating the business logic that you actually need instead of writing boilerplate code to actually get to the data that enables you to write that business logic. So where Azure Functions abstract away the infrastructure of what you're doing, you just say, hey, here's my code, run it for me. Triggers and bindings abstract away the resources you're interacting with. So for instance, again, storage, if you would like to have a function be triggered when a new blob is created in a storage account, you can. And to even take it a step further, it even allows you to have that blob that was added to that storage account available as a stream, right, going into your function. So you don't have to think about any of it. You just talk to the stream and you're done. But with static website hosting and the function app for an API, you have a relatively cheap solution, right? Since storage, the costs are relatively low, and with functions, you only pay where you use. So that's awesome. However, static website hosting does not support CORS, so cross-origin resource sharing. And for those of you who might not know what that means, cross-origin resource sharing actually means that I am an application on domain A, and I would like to talk to an API that's hosted on domain B. Domain B needs to explicitly allow me to call that API since I'm not hosted on the same domain. This is actually to prevent applications from just talking to any APIs out there that they're not supposed to talk to. but also to prevent users in a browser to call external APIs without them knowing, since it's in a different domain. There's no support for HTTPS with custom domains, so then you need to go add a Azure CDN, and then you need to go add a custom domain over there with some certificates, and you need to manage all of that manually. And then last but definitely not least, there's no support for headers in static website hosting on Azure Storage. So because you need to do all of those extra resources, if you want to have a custom domain and HTTPS enabled, you will have multiple Azure resources, which need multiple deployments potentially. And then still you have those DNS/CORS issues because you need to allow the API to be called by the custom domain that is connected to your static website hosting. So getting up and running, deploying a static web app with some dynamic content in the back on Azure used to be quite cumbersome, right? You needed to add quite a few things to make sure that everything worked. Now, introducing static web apps. Static web apps enable you to develop serverless web apps fast with global reach and scale. Now, this, of course, is the marketing term. However, this is actually true. It does allow you to develop serverless web apps fast. And I will show you in the demo later on how fast that actually is. Now, let's first cover the basics. Static web apps automatically builds and deploys web apps from your repository. It's tailored to a developer's daily workflow, and it separates your static assets from the traditional web server. Let's first dive into those 3 points. Since it automatically creates a CI/CD pipeline for you, it completely integrates with everything you're used to as far as developer tools go, like Git or GitHub, Azure repos. It completely separates the static stuff from a traditional web server, which means you don't need compute for your web server, which we do need if we run, for instance, an ASP.NET application. And then the last point is actually really interesting. It's served from points geographically distributed around the world. Now, this is not just Azure regions. This is points of presence. And points of presence are actually even closer to the end user than all the Azure data centers are, since these are the CDN endpoints that Microsoft uses for its own CDN offering inside of Azure. So right off the bat, we get a lot of stuff by default available when we start using static web apps. But of course, there's more, because there's always more, right? This is actually a relatively old image, since here it actually has GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps pipelines, both of them available. And it has static content on the right and an API running on Azure Functions. Now, if you look at the first version of static web apps, this was, I think, 2 years ago. The only thing we had was a JavaScript front end and a JavaScript function app. So the very, very first solution Microsoft built for static web apps was a JavaScript-based front end, let's say Node, or of course Angular or any JavaScript front end, with JavaScript Azure Functions only running from a GitHub repo. So the first ever solution for static web apps was GitHub JavaScript. And that already shows us a bit that Microsoft is really targeting full stack developers from that, let's say, ecosystem inside of our industry. So it was actually really targeting people who are used to working with tools like, let's say, Netlify to host their applications in a structured way. Then I think for almost half a year, nothing happened on Azure Static Web Apps. And then a new big Microsoft event came along. So the first introduction was Build, I think 2 years ago. And then for Ignite, they actually added C# as a language for API functions. so for the function app, which meant that with the second increment, we got GitHub with C# and JavaScript. Then Azure DevOps Pipelines was added with the next iteration, with the next build actually that came along. And now we're seeing more and more continuous growth and improvement on the Azure Static Web Apps offering. And also it is now out and publicly available as being generally available. So it now has a decent base level of where we are. And it's actually enabling us to do more and more with each increment of the product that we're seeing. Now, looking at the front ends, right off the bat, we get Angular, Blazor, Next, Nuxt, React, Svelte, and Vue as front-end frameworks. Now, this is actually a list of supported front ends in the UI when you start creating a static web app in the Azure portal. But you could do any JavaScript front end, and you can build your own pipeline, and it will still work. So while these are enabled for you by default, so you just pick one from the list, you configure it a bit, and then you'll know how it works, you can even dive into all of the other frameworks that we have available, JavaScript that is, and build your own build pipeline. As far as static site generators go, it currently supports Gatsby, Hugo, and VuePress. And you can also have some custom stuff available right there. But what I wanted to say about the fact that the static site generators are available as well, this means if you currently have your web application running or your website running as a Hugo website, but you still have it hosted somewhere else, or let's say, as in my own personal scenario, you have Hugo based on static website hosting on Azure Storage since static web apps weren't around yet. Migrating over to Azure Static Web Apps is literally, if you have some experience, literally not more than an hour's work, since it's all provided for you by default out of the box. More on that later. So that's the basics for the front end, right? So now let's look at the back end. The back end uses Azure Functions. Wow, I do need to push the right button. So the back end by default uses Azure Functions, and by default the API of a static web app is an Azure Functions application which is managed and deployed by Azure Static Web Apps associated with some restrictions, which means you can only run HTTPS triggered functions. So no functions that are triggered, for instance, on creating a new blob or putting new information in Cosmos DB, since it's meant to be an API. So if you have the managed functions, there are some restrictions, but you also don't need to manage anything. It's just there and it works. Now, optionally, you can provide an existing Azure Functions application of any plan type, which is accompanied with all the features of Azure Functions. And then with this configuration, of course, you are responsible to handle a separate deployment for the Functions app. However, you're also more in control of what that function app is actually doing for you. It has integrated security. It has seamless routing. This should go in the front end, right? So the front end has integrated security and seamless routing. So you have direct access to user authentication, and role-based authorization data makes the API route available to the web app securely without requiring custom CORS rules. What that means, if you have www.thisismywebapplication.com as the front end, then your API backend Azure function will be www.thisismyazureStaticWebsite. I'm not really sure if I had the domain name correct the second time, .com/API. So your domain.com/API, or your domain/API will be the endpoint where you can actually talk to your functions. Now, for those managed functions, as I said before, it's HTTP triggered only, it's consumption plan only, it has integrated security, and it has integrated routing. And then currently it supports Node.js, .NET Core, .NET 6, and Python as the tools that you use to build those backend functions. Now, as soon as you start bringing your own functions, you can have functions of all trigger types, of all the runtimes that are available on Azure Functions by default. You can either use consumption, premium, or the dedicated plan. It enables you to have durable functions. It enables you to use managed identity. So there's a lot to say for a bring your own function solution as soon as you need more control of what actually happened in that backend. However, if your application only needs to get some static content or some dynamic content, for instance, for a web application, for a website with some content, so a CMS, let's say, this would be an awesome solution. So I think it might be time to show this in a demo. And I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to open up my Azure portal first. And then in the Azure portal, let me scale that a bit. In the Azure portal, we have this option to create a static web app. So let's just create it here. We'll do static web app appears. If I search for it at least. And then I can create this one. And what's cool is I'm going to pick the resource group we were already in. I'm going to enter a name, and this is my static web app. Now, not as other Azure services like storage and app service require you to fill in a globally unique name right here. You can put in everything right here, since the URL will not be this is my static web app.azurestaticwebapps.net or something like that. They will generate a globally unique URL for you. And one of the things, or one of the reasons they do this, is because they really like you to use a custom domain instead of being dependent on the URL that they created for you. So this is my static web app. That's the name. And here you already see the plan. So I'm going to go for free for now. I'm going to go West Europe. And this is where it already shows you, okay, so that list is smaller than I'm used to using Azure. So it only has Central, East US, and West US, East Asia, and West Europe. Well, the reason for this is these are the primary Azure regions. And since Azure Static Web Apps enables you to push out the information out to all of the points of presence of Azure, the actual location of the static web app might not be that important. So you just pick the one, the main region that's closest to you. And from there, it will just work. So I'll pick West Europe since I'm in the Netherlands. And then we right off the bat see here that we have Azure DevOps as an option or GitHub. Now I'm going to do GitHub because I have a repo open that we can use for this. And I'm already logged in. And then if you logged in, you can already see the organizations that you're connected to. So I'll pick my own user as the organization. The repository will be SWA HTGR or Static Web Apps hit the ground running. And I'll do the main branch. So this branch is actually important, and I'm going to show you why in a bit. But right here, you select what's the actual configuration of that I'm using right now. So am I building Angular? Am I building Svelte? Am I doing Hugo? Well, in this case, we're doing Blazor. And I know that my app application or my app location is htgr.web. I think I call it something like that. And currently, I don't have the API in right now. So as you can see right here, app location is required. However, API location and output location are not, since if you leave this blank, it will take the default for Blazor. And in this case, it automatically pre-filled it with root, since that's the location where my content will be going. This is actually the folder that my project, in this case, my Blazor project, is in. And this is it. I mean, if I now click Review and Create, it will show you that we could go and create this. Of course, I already did that. So if we go here, we have this right here available. Let's check real fast. Those need to be on right now. Thank you very much. And here we have a static web app, and you can see that there's already some requests coming in. If we go Essentials and we click it, hello Microsoft Azure Week. Okay, so this application now runs on Azure Static Web Apps. And if we refresh it, we can see some loading since it's Blazor, but it's fast, it's there. And if you look at the URL, it's Witty Sky 0 AC5. Okay, so it really generated a globally unique URL for me. But what did it actually do in GitHub, since I needed to connect to GitHub and I even had to say which branch do I use? So if we go into GitHub, and I'll scale this one a bit as well. If we go into GitHub, we can see that there's this htgr.web location or folder that actually has the Blazor WebAssembly in. But what it actually did, if we go up one level, is we can see here now .github/workflows. That's actually not created by me. And if I look at this, I can see that they actually created for me a complete Azure Static Web Apps CI/CD GitHub Actions workflow to build on Ubuntu latest, to build and deploy my static web app, and it does this all automatically. Nothing which is in this. I have not done anything manually to this file to have it work. It does actually show up currently that I did this since I'm now logged into the Azure portal when I create this. However, we used to, and maybe I can even show that. This is something that I didn't check, but it might be interesting to have a look at these, since these are some older examples when we only had GitHub functions Azure JavaScript functions. Wow. So I actually had that in place right here. Potentially, if I go to workflows here, we can see the contributor. Well, it's contributed back to me, so that's a good thing. They actually fixed that one. It used to be a separate contributor for static web apps. Going back to the one that we just had right now is SWA-HTGR. There's another cool thing. So they have these runs that go on right here. It actually builds and deploys my application to Azure, but I'm going to do something just real quick. So we're going Microsoft Visual Studio. I have this in presentation mode, so please don't think that this is my general way of working with Visual Studio. It does allow me to do some stuff during demos, which enables people to actually see what's happening. So I'm pulling Visual Studio as soon as it's loaded, since if it's still loading, I can drag it. I'm going to pull this over. What we see right here is the application that we just saw. So on the index page, we have that image which I blatantly ripped from SharePointEurope.com, since this is the logo for Microsoft Azure Week, which we are in right now. However, what I do think is that this can use some interesting new features. So I'm going to improve on styling. I'm going to do so based on the current main branch. So let's create my branch. I'm there, and I go in CSS, go to the app, and then I think, you know what? I think that a background color would be beneficial to have. Pink. Is that a color? No, I'll just do. Take this one. Yeah, that should be good, right? And then, of course, if we want to do this decently, we want to have a font family. Wow, which says, I mean, come on. And the font size probably needs to be XX large. So I think that this looks a lot better. So I'm going to go into Git changes. Is this enough? It needs to be really horrible. Well, this is enough for now. So I'm going to go Git changes. I'll add this one. I'll say this looks so much better. Commit stage and sync. We're probably going to get something right here. It's not there yet. I did ask it. I need to push this. I didn't push out my branch yet. So there we go. So I'm going to create a pull request and I'm going to say, what do you think? Let's create that pull request. So I created a pull request now, right? And I changed some stuff about the styling. I think it looks a lot better. I haven't even checked, but hey, that's what pull requests are for. So I'm going to leave this on for now just a little bit. What we did see is that we have a GitHub repo in this case, where we have an Azure Blazor, Blazor WebAssembly front end without any APIs connected right now. And we have an Azure resource, which is a static web app that actually hosts that application. So I'm going to go back to the presentation right now. I'm going to go show you this one later on. So that was the real basic demo. This is how you start Azure Static Web Apps. Now, that's the basics. And I said that you would be able to hit the ground running after this session, and then we need some additional stuff. So one of the things that's interesting for Azure Static Web Apps is, of course, if you have a front-end framework that actually does your application, if you go to a specific route, let's say mydomain.com/fetch data, it will not recognize that, since static website hosting will by default try and find a file that you can use there, and then if that file is not available, it's not going to be able to do something for you. So you might want to provide a default fallback route, for instance, but you might also want to do stuff with authorization or authentication, or maybe you even have some headers that you would like to add to your application to enable you to have HSTS headers, for instance, so that it always is connected to over HTTPS. Now, we used to have routes.json for that one, but we now have staticwebapp.config.json, which is a file of a specific structure that you can use inside of your static web app, which will allow you to configure routing, authentication, authorization, fallback rules, HTTP response overrides if you need to, headers, MIME types, and even networking options. Which means that this file will enable you to have a much better suited application running on static web apps. So I'm going to go over and pick my laser pointer for a sec. So first of all, for instance, what you see here is routes. So you define routes for the application right here. And then you say, if somebody asks for the route/login, we will internally rewrite that to go to /auth/login/AAD. Now, this seems like it's just a rewrite, but it also means something else, since it also means that you can log in using Azure Active Directory by default without you having to code anything. Even better, it also enables you to use Twitter as an authentication provider, or GitHub. Those are all baked in, those are all available off the bat, and you can just as simply use .auth/login/ I think it's just GitHub, and then you will use GitHub login for your application. Now, the same with for the route for /logout, it goes to .auth/logout, and that actually logs you out of the service for Azure Static Web Apps. Now, you can do .auth/me, and you will get the information of the logged in user. So if a user logs in to your static web app using this authentication mechanism, .auth/me gives you all of the information that the authentication provider gives you based on the user that's actually logged in. Now we see a navigation fallback right here that everything falls back to index.html. And this, of course, is needed if you have a single page application that runs your application to enable you to use the routing, for instance, inside of Angular or inside of Blazor WebAssembly, since the routing is handled in the index.html file. And of course, in this case, you exclude everything that's under CSS or images because you don't want to rewrite the navigation for an image to be index.html, because then none of your images will work. You have a response override option where it says if anybody gets a 401, just redirect them to login. And in this case, we have global headers for a content security policy, and you can add that as you see fit. So this file enables you to do all of that stuff and more. The cool thing is, if you invite a user to use an Azure Static Web App, you can give them a role, and by default, all of the roles, well, you're free to use any that you define yourself. By default, you have anonymous, since anonymous users, all anonymous users fall into that category, but you can have as many roles as you would like to think of, you can use. However, there is a maximum of 50 distinct roles inside of this one static web app config JSON file. The file size is maxed out at 100 kilobytes, but it's just JSON. So if you want to have 100 kilobytes of configuration JSON for your web application, that's quite a lot of config. Now, another thing that's interesting is, let's think about the fact that we might have an Azure API, Azure Functions API as the backend, and a Blazor WebAssembly as the front end, and I would like to try out authorization, I would like to try out the routing, I would like to see how all of that works together. How am I going to do that locally, right? Since I can use Blazor WebAssembly and run it locally, and I can run my Azure Function locally, but then the URLs are different, and authentication won't work. Well, they actually thought about that one as well, and not too long ago, Static Web Apps CLI was now made available as generally available software that's out there. So you can run the CLI locally. You can actually completely specify if you want to take a static content server or the framework development server. Do you want to use authentication and authorization based on your configuration file? Where are the APIs that you would like to run, and how do you want to integrate them? And this CLI enables you to take all of those components. So take the front end that's running from a debug session from Visual Studio, take the Azure Functions runtime that are actually running on your local machine as well, combine all of those using Azure Static Web App CLI, and you get one URL locally with port 4280 that enables you to access the static content, use the static content to access the API under the /API endpoint, all with the authentication and authorization that you have in place in your static web app config.json file. So please have a look at the static web app CLI. The link will be available at the end of the session, but still, the static web app CLI is awesome for local development of a static web app. Now, we already saw a bit about the hosting plans, but I would like to dive into that just a little bit more. Considering time, I won't go into that into too much detail. But in the end, you have a free option, and the free option actually does a lot. You've got web hosting, you've got GitHub, you've got DevOps integration. You can have globally distributed static content. You get free and automatically renewing SSL certificates. I mean, wow. Free automatically renewing SSL. No more running Azure Functions to the side to talk to Let's Encrypt, or no more reminders in your calendar to go to Let's Encrypt every, let's say, 30 or 60 days to renew. It does that all automatically for you. You get a max app size of 250 megabytes. Again, it's static web app, so it's kind of big. You get 2 custom domains per app. It by default works with managed Azure Functions, and the authentication provider integrations are those that are pre-configured. Now, I explicitly stepped over the staging environment, since this is potentially a good moment to actually get out of this again and go back to our GitHub environment. And here's a pull request that we created earlier, which says that this looks so much better. And all of the checks are done, but actually this little message right here, this is huge. Azure Static Web Apps, your stage site is ready. And for those of you who saw that Witty Sky URL earlier and memorized it, you might see that this now has a -1 behind that wasn't there on the Static Web App. And again, even if I go here and I go to the essentials, that -1 isn't there. In this pull request, it has a -1. And this means, did I really not write Comic Sans correctly? I don't have Comic Sans, that's horrible. But you do see the pink, right? So what we see right now is the result of the pull request ready and available on Azure right there, while my original application is still up and running and doesn't see anything about the changes that were made in the pull request. Now, what they're doing right here, and then we're going to go environments, what they're doing right here is they create a preview deployment for each pull request that you add automatically. And this works for DevOps and for GitHub alike. It actually tells me what branch I'm on, and if I click there, I go directly to the branch. It tells me which pull request I'm looking at. It's pull request number 1, and if I click this, I go to the actual pull request. And then right here, I have this browse button, which takes me to the web application where I can actually see the result of what my pull request would actually mean for the application itself. Now, this is, as long as colors go, potentially not great, and maybe the text is a bit big too. So what I could do now is actually go into GitHub and let's not merge this pull request. Let's just close it since nope. And the cool thing is this will not happen instantly, but this preview deployment will automatically be removed for me now. But this is awesome, right? We do some changes. We get an environment where testers can go and click and see if everything works, or maybe the one reviewing the pull request will go there and automatically validate how it's working. I mean, this is pretty powerful. Now, so those types of staging environments, you get 3 on the free plan. And if you go to the standard plan, you get 10 of those. You also get more custom domains, and you can have APIs via Azure Functions in both the managed or the bring your own function app solution. Now, included bandwidth on the free plan is 100 gigs a month, as it is with the standard plan. However, if you go over that, the free plan will just stop. It will just stop giving you information, while the standard plan will go into an overage where it actually says almost 17 cents per gig for the outgoing bandwidth. This is the same as normal outgoing bandwidth in Azure. So it's not cheaper, it's not more expensive, it's just the same as outgoing bandwidth. Now, the free plan, you might think of what that costs. So that actually doesn't cost anything since it's free. But the standard plan, it's been quite a while, it's taken them quite a while to actually come up with the pricing. And then I was getting a bit anxious, okay, so what is this pricing going to be? And I thought, well, looking at a decent default app service, which is like, what, 50 or 60 euros a month, what it will be, 20, 30 euros a month, I'm not really sure. It's 7.59 euros a month for the standard plan, which assumes that you have 730 hours of use on the function app, which you potentially don't have, since it might be that you don't even use the function that much, since your application doesn't run all the time. 7.59 euros, and you get all of this integrated security and integrated development environment, CI/CD support, globally distributed. As far as I'm concerned, it's pretty powerful. Now, we need to go into one more feature before we go to the resources and then the questions, and that's the new features that they currently added. I think it was June 21st when the blog post came out. I'm not entirely sure, so that's exactly a month from today, a month ago. They announced new features. Please be advised, this is for the standard tier, so the paid tier only, but you will probably see why as soon as we go into what it actually means. So the new features, or the most important new feature that they added, we have now app service, container apps, or API management as potential back services for static web apps. And this is actually pretty huge. So they started out with static front end and a functions API, But I can imagine if you start moving towards relatively large applications, that maybe Azure Functions are not always the way to go. If you go into a lot of data processing or a lot of data retrieval through your API, you might want to cache some stuff. And adding Redis to your function app blows up the price, right? So now you have these options where you don't necessarily use an Azure function as the API, but you can also use a normal app service or container apps or even API management, which means that you could use the rate limiting and the quotas that API management provides and have them be behind your Azure Static Web App and enable you to use those services as the backend option. So what it actually does is it enables you to link a resource to a static web app environment. All requests to /API are then by default routed to the resource that you connected. And it allows your front end to call the API without you having to configure any cores, since the /API route will automatically route to the backend you linked to your static web app. It also enables seamless authentication with your API, which means it will add an XMS client authorization header to requests that go to the backend, so that by default, your backend will now be secured and only be accessible from your static web app frontend. Now, this was actually my first reaction when I started reading this, although I didn't have the scrunchies in my hair, but this was actually actual footage of me, or at least something that looked quite similar. And the way you work with this is you go APIs right here. And as you can see, I already created that right in this application. You have APIs right here. And then for your production environment, in this case, I have linked up an API management instance. And this is actually literally everything I could do. So I'll go to my own website, which is also a static web app, since I migrated from Hugo, from hosting it in a static website hosting on Azure Storage towards Azure Static Web App. And then if I go APIs, if you click link right here, you can have a function app, a container app, API management, or a web app as the backend. Let's say web app, and I would like to take this one. I can just pull the web app that I actually need, or I'll take function app and pull the function app that I need, or API management, pull the API management that I need. And from that point on, all requests to /API for this static web app will be directed to that Azure resource, which is kind of awesome. Now, while we are here, as you can see here, this has custom domains connected to it, which means that my domain here is rikvandenbos.net. And you can see this is a blog that I write using Hugo. And you can already see this is fast, right? I mean, this is instant. It doesn't even blink if I refresh. And that's because it's all point of presence pushed out there. And the way you do that for the point of presence, just before we dive into resources, would be to have enterprise grade edge. And enterprise grade edge actually uses something that is quite similar, or actually powered by Azure Front Door, and it actually hosts all of your application, so all of the static content in CDNs in the edge, making it awfully fast. Now, there's a ton of things I could still talk about here, but we do need to take time into account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the role management for a different application that I have available right here. Come on, there we go. So as you can see here, or can't? Yeah, we need some, there they are. So as you can see right here, we have different roles. We have me being an admin and being anonymous and authenticated, since you're always anonymous. And if I'm logged in with that account, it's authenticated. And here I have this is Bicycle Land, but then in Dutch, which is actually a local bike shop. And they use an Azure Static Web App powered application to manage all of their internal orders. So the orders that they have with their providers, they all manage in an application. And it uses integrated authentication. If anybody logs into this email address in that application, it just works. As you can see here, this runs on the hosting plan free, which means the enterprise grade and managed identity are not available, but I do have the APIs available here, or at least the blade is enabled. But if I want to select it, or I want to link up an API using API management, it actually does say that link backends are not supported in free hosting plan. One thing that I didn't mention was configuration. So if you have any settings that your functions are going to need, you have application settings right here, just as you would have for instance, an app service. And then here we have a storage connection string because that application actually talks to a table storage. Okay, anyhow, let's go back to this one, since there's a lot to be found about static web apps. And I've tried to take most of the interesting information, add them all to the urlist.com/ASWA. The URL list is a thing that some Microsofties built for Build a few years ago. And it's actually a service that enables you to have one URL, and then it lists all of the URLs that I want to have underneath right there. So I will be adding the blog post to the new backend services that are available to Static Web Apps right now, since I don't have that one in there right yet, but it will be in there in like 5 minutes from now. So you could either scan the QR code or go to the urlist.com/ASWA and see the links right there. If there are any questions, then I will take them gladly right now. But if you come up with a question later on, then don't hesitate to drop me a line at rickvdbosch@outlook.com or rickvdbosch in any of the other online profiles, since I think that LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram and all of my accounts, GitHub, are all that handles. So you should be able to get a hold of me right there.
Thanks so much, Rick. So as Rick said, if you have any questions, pop them into the questions window now, and I'll go ahead and ask them. There are a couple of questions in there to get us started. Rick, is it possible to use custom authentication with static web apps? What languages are available?
Okay, so custom authentication, I'm going to go back to this slide. As you can see here, as soon as you use the free plan, you by default get the pre-configured ones. And let's try and see if we can go right there and go. I need to check real quick right here. Invite. So by default, we have available Azure Active Directory, which is, for instance, an Outlook account, Git or an enterprise account, GitHub and Twitter. Those are all available and generally available. Facebook and Google are in there by preview, so you can have Google. You'll type the email address. Yes, this is my name in Italian. What is the domain? And then you could say, well, this is an admin 2. This invitation expires in 1 hour. And then if I generate, I get this unique URL that is blurred right here because I don't want to share that information. But that invite link is then sent to the person that you actually would like to invite, and they can actually enable access for themselves to that application. So these are the authentication providers that are available by default on the free plan. If you go to the paid plan, which this one is actually part of, and we invite somebody here, then we can actually configure an extra identity provider. That's not in the UI right here, but we can order extra identity provider, which means that you can use custom registration. So actually anything that enables you to use OpenID Connect enables you to be used as an authentication provider on the standard plan.
Great, thank you. One more question. Can I use something else other than GitHub or Azure DevOps?
That's actually a good question as well. As I said, we started out with GitHub, and then we moved into using DevOps as well. Currently, they have GitLab and Bitbucket as the 2 extra services that are available to do this for. So they are actually working really hard in making this more and more a mature service. Again, they started out with only JavaScript, and now they have a lot more languages that are supported, but also as far as CI/CD environments go, they are increasing those options. So currently the options are Azure DevOps, GitHub, Bitbucket, and GitLab. But probably more will be coming soon.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a million, Rick. That's the end of the questions. That's all we have. On behalf of the ESPC community, thanks so much for taking the time today. It was a great presentation.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks everybody for joining us. This presentation will be recorded and added to our resource center, and I'll let you know when it's available. That's it for today. Goodbye.